what can we eat? And the Jesuits said, well, you can eat fish. Well, what counts as fish? Well, anything that comes out of the water. And they were like, woohoo, let's eat capybaras. They come out of the water. And I can't remember which country, but there's actually Amazonian culture down there, Catholic culture now, where they still have the tradition of eating capybara on fasting days in the Catholic Church, which is, of course, not a fish. But they were like, who wants to eat capybara anyway? We'll let it pass,
Carrie, thank you for your question. Thanks for watching us today on Facebook. Here's one now from Mike, who wants to know, is Easter the only time a convert can enter the church?
Nope. I came in November the 16th.
Yes, you did. Okay, so it can be done.
Sure.
Probably the norm is
the
to
norm.
come in
it's the norm, right?
for
Because,
an adult.
The Easter Vigil liturgy is like specially oriented towards that. It's very beautiful. I mean, there's a part of me that's glad I came in November, and there's a part of me that regrets that I didn't get to participate in that glorious Easter Vigil liturgy.
Yeah, it really is something. When we come back from our quick break, we'll talk with Chris in St. Louis, listening to us on Covenant Radio. And we have got a line open for you right now, 833-288-EWTN, if you have a question about the Catholic faith, 833-288-3986. Call to communion in progress on this Wednesday afternoon here on EWTN.
Sharing the fullness of the Catholic faith. 1-833-288-EWTN. 1-833-288-3986. This is Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders on the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network.
Carry EWTN with you everywhere when you download the EWTN app. You can enjoy EWTN TV and radio live streams, shows on demand, prayers and devotionals, and the latest Catholic news. Visit EWTNapps.com today.
And this is an EWTN Bookmark Brief. I'm Doug Keck, your host. I just finished interviewing Colleen C. Mitchell on Bookmark on her latest book, Who Does He Say You Are?, published by Franciscan Media, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. So tell us, Colleen, what's this book about?
It is a scriptural walk through Jesus' encounters with 12 women in the Gospels that allows Catholic women, Christian women to look at the question of who Jesus says we are, what our identity is in him, and grow from wherever we are in our faith into a deeper understanding and a deeper intimacy of who we are in Christ and the relationship he desires to have for us. And so this is a example of how women found new life in him so that we can follow them into that new life.
Right, and our Lord wants that for all of us. Okay, very good. Colleen C. Mitchell, author of Who Does He Say You Are? Women Transformed by Christ in the Gospels, published by Franciscan Media, available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. And this has been an EWTN Bookmark Brief. Thanks.
Dr. Greg Popcak.
We want listeners to see that God has a unique and unrepeatable plan for their lives and how to rejoice in the work God is doing in their hearts and in their homes.
The leading Catholic voices are on EWTN Radio.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-833-288-EWTN. 1-833-288-3986.
What a great show we have coming up for you tomorrow morning. It's the Sunrise Morning Show at 6 a.m. Eastern. Catholic counselor Kevin Prendergast will be on, I believe it's in the last segment of the hour, on coping with the suicide of a loved one and how the church views it. It is tough. It is a very, very tough thing. Kevin Prendergast is an excellent counselor. He'll have a lot of sage advice for you, and that'll be tomorrow morning at 6 a.m. Eastern, the Sunrise Morning Show, right here on EWTN Radio. If you're ready now, let's go to the phones at 833-288-EWTN. We begin with Chris in St. Louis, listening to us on the great Covenant Radio. Hey there, Chris. What's on your mind today?
Hi. Quick question regarding the exception to the prohibition on divorce being unfaithfulness in the Bible. What does the church teach? Does the church uphold the exception to the prohibition on divorce, or does the church not? And if not, why?
Sure. Thank you very much. So, first of all, let's be very clear what we're talking about. We're talking about Matthew chapter 19, verse 9, where Christ says it is unlawful for a man to divorce his wife for any reason except for And then the Greek word is porneia. And so what really the operative question here is, what does porneia mean? What is this exception? Well, if you look at 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 1, you'll see an instance where St. Paul actually counsels separation, all right, due to the porneia clause. And it's the case of a man who has taken to himself his father's wife, okay? Now, he says this is a kind of porneia that doesn't even exist among pagans, okay? Now, what's going on here, and why is this an issue? All right, because in the next chapter, in 1 Corinthians chapter 6, St. Paul says it's unlawful to divorce your spouse for any reason, and that if you do, you have to remain unmarried or else be reconciled to your wife. Okay, so what's the difference here? Well, Acts chapter 15 elucidates. In that passage, the question arose, how much of the Mosaic law must be imposed on Gentile converts? How much of the Mosaic law must be imposed on Gentile converts to the Christian faith? And what the apostles ruled in Acts 15 was only two things from the Mosaic law, specific to the Mosaic law, should be imposed on Gentile converts. One was the prohibition on eating blood of sacrificial animals, and the other one was the rules governing the validity of marriage pertaining to consanguinity. All right, so there are lists in the Mosaic law about who you can lawfully marry, all right, and that you are constrained by rules of consanguinity. Now, in Hebrew moral thinking, consanguinity means more than genetically similar DNA, all right? So it's more than just biological descent, that the contract of marriage actually constitutes the husband and wife as a new organism, one flesh. And so even though I am biologically unrelated to my spouse, through marriage we become one flesh. And therefore, she would be off limits to, even if I were to die, she would be off limits to immediate members of my family, all right, because having become one flesh with me, those rules of consanguinity would now come into effect, okay? And that's why St. Paul can, in 1 Corinthians 5, say, this guy's got to put this woman away from him, all right, because he violated the rules governing porneia, whereas in 1 Corinthians 6, he says, you can't divorce for any reason, and if you do, you have to remain unmarried, okay? And so the tradition of the church in interpreting Matthew 19:9 is that, as Jesus said, what God has joined together, man cannot separate for any reason whatsoever under the sun, all right? But in constituting a valid marriage, the laws of consanguinity still apply, all right? And that remains the practice within the Catholic Church to this day. So, if you are validly married, one man, one woman, all right, baptized people in a sacramental marriage with grace accompanying them for the arduous task of being a father and mother in the church, all right, if you have a valid Christian marriage, that can't be dissolved for any reason. If there's an egregious crime like adultery or abandonment, and cohabitation, maintaining conjugal relations, becomes a moral, psychological, or physical impossibility, then the church follows what St. Paul teaches in 1 Corinthians 6, which is that you shouldn't divorce your spouse, but if you do, you have to remain unmarried. Right? That's the practice of the Catholic Church. So if there were adultery or some egregious crime that required a civil divorce because you needed to actually sue for protection or for maintenance or support or some such thing, the church would allow that if it was an egregious case. But the biblical law would apply. You have to remain unmarried. You're actually married to one woman. You may not live together anymore, but you can't go take another one, okay? Now, if there is an impediment to a valid marriage, consanguinity would be one impediment. You know, you wake up and find out, like Oedipus, that you married your mother by mistake, okay? The church would say, well, that marriage is null and void. There wasn't a marriage there to begin with. So it's not a divorce. It's a declaration that you never were validly married. Okay. All right. Put that away from you. So, you know, if the situation in 1 Corinthians 5 happened, you woke up and found out that you'd accidentally married, or maybe intentionally married, your father's widow or whatever, the church would say, nope, violated the rules on consanguinity, not a valid marriage, not a valid marriage, get that away from you.
Very good. Chris, does that make sense to you?
That does. There's a lot to digest there. I'll have to listen to this again. I appreciate it. But I do have a follow-up, real quick clarification. So you're saying that if say I were to pass away, and my current wife and my brother were to get married, the church would not actually allow that.
Okay, so before I answer that yes or no, if there are some strict specifications within the Code of Canon Law about degrees of consanguinity that are allowable or not allowable. Okay, I'm not going to get in because I hadn't reviewed the statute recently, so I'm not up to date on precisely all the relations that are prohibited or allowed. Okay. And so I'm not going to answer that question directly. I will tell you that question is directly answered in the Code of Canon Law. But the principle is what matters, that there are impediments to a valid marriage, consanguinity being one. What degrees of relation are allowed or disallowed, I obviously hadn't read recently, and I don't want to misstate.
Sure. Got it. Chris, thank you so much for your call. That opens up a line for you now, 833-288-EWTN. If you have a question for Dr. David Anders, anything about the Catholic faith, something that's been on your mind, maybe that you want to get answered properly, what does the church actually teach? This is a great way to find out. 833-288-3986. We go now to Chandler in Rochester, New York, listening on the great station of the Cross. Hey, Chandler, what's on your mind today?
Hi. I was just wondering, because I have a few Catholic friends, how come that women are allowed to wear like a veil to Mass, for prayer, but men are not allowed to wear anything on their head for prayer?
Okay, thanks, Chandler. I appreciate the question. So I am not aware specifically that there is a law or a rubric in the church that specifically prohibits headgear for men in church. There may be one, but I'm not aware that there's one. And I've certainly never seen any such law enforced in a Catholic congregation. That being said, there is a biblical tradition from 1 Corinthians chapter 11 that states that prohibition directly, that women are to have their head covered and men are not to have their head covered. And Paul gives reasons that are germane to the culture of first century Judaism to explain that. And that's why there is a tradition of head covering for women in Mass that is not currently enforced as law in the Catholic Church. There are women who continue to practice that out of deference to tradition and so forth, but it's not obligatory.
Okay, just grabbing some, I got a little cough there for a moment. Just grabbing
I
some
choked
water.
you up, Tom.
You did. So I hope that's helpful for you, Chandler. I guess it's more of a custom that a man would not wear a hat indoors.
Yeah,
really just
I
about
was
any
taught,
place.
I didn't grow up Catholic, but I was always taught, by my parents, you take your hat off in the presence of, a woman or the elderly or inside. And I mean,
Inside an office building,
Yeah,
even.
it was a convention of
Sure.
politeness.
Okay. Very good. Chandler, thank you again for your call. This is Call to Communion here on EWTN. 833-288-EWTN is our number, 833-288-3986. Looks like we have a line available for you right now. Here's a question from Justin checking us out today on Facebook. What would you say to someone saying that his problem is that the Catholic Church was born out of a Hellenistic, Platonic, or perhaps even a Gnostic influence? A lot of the early church fathers were straight up anti-Semitic, and we're still feeling that theology today. What say you?
Okay, thanks. I think we're confusing three different things here. First of all, the origins of the Catholic Church are Hebraic and Jewish, not Hellenistic. And no one has made a stronger case for that position than the biblical scholar N.T. Wright. And if you'll read his Christian Origins series, which is quite lengthy and extremely scholarly, he makes a very, very rigorous multi-volume argument to that effect. So clearly Christ was a Jew, the apostles were Jews, the earliest Christian community were Jews, and anticipating and aiming for the inclusion of Gentiles. Now, in the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century of the church, as Gentiles were included in the body of Christian faithful, and the Catholic Church came to take on a far more Gentile character, it is undeniably true that as they made the philosophical case for Christianity, and they reached not just for biblical revelation, but for arguments to show that biblical revelation was reasonable, all right, they drew upon the resources of Hellenistic philosophy. Now, Plato was one stream of Hellenistic philosophy that they drew on. There were others. So we find Stoic influence, Aristotelian influence, Platonian, Neoplatonic influence of Plotinus and Porphyry, and other schools of ancient Greek and Roman philosophy. Thanks be to God.
Yeah.
Okay, so to me, this is not in any way, shape, form, or fashion detracting from the credibility of the Christian faith, but is one of my prime motives for becoming Catholic, quite honestly.
Really?
Right? Because I was raised in a tradition that eschewed philosophical reason, and what a breath of fresh air to come into the Catholic intellectual tradition and see the coherence of the truth claims of the Catholic faith with the tradition of philosophy and reason. And of course, as Christianity has spread throughout the world and philosophical reason has evolved through the ages, Catholics have availed themselves of many, many schools of philosophical reason, not just Hellenistic, but Eastern, as well as modern schools of philosophy like phenomenology or existentialism. I myself am an avid, I don't consider myself to be a philosopher. I'm not that smart, but I'm an avid consumer of philosophy. I read lots of it. And of course, Catholic theology has always relied heavily on the philosophical discipline. In fact, the formation of priests begins with a 4-year course in philosophy, all right, so that specifically we can make the case for Christian faith in terms that are intelligible not only to Catholics but to non-Catholics as well, and show that it's reasonable. So I'm just thrilled to death that the fathers of the church took that position. In terms of Gnosticism, the Catholic Church was the great opponent of Gnosticism in the 2nd century. Great Catholic theologians and fathers of the church, like Irenaeus in particular, renowned for their anti-Gnostic writings. There were others like Clement of Alexandria and Origen of Alexandria that took a little bit of a more moderate line towards Gnosticism, but the central claims of Gnosticism, namely the radical dichotomy between flesh and spirit, the division of revelation into 2 testaments with 2 different gods and so forth, a Gnostic view of salvation that separated salvation from the moral life or from the body, all of these things were rejected wholesale by the Catholic Church and continue to be rejected to this day. I find that outside of Catholicism, you find much more capitulation to Gnosticism, both in other Christian traditions and in secular philosophy. There's a Gnostic tendency, I believe, at the heart of the modern philosophical enterprise in the works of somebody like Descartes and the sort of radical mind-body dualism that we find there. Catholicism has always held that man is a unity, a substantial unity of body and soul, and that the salvation is the salvation of the whole person, body and soul, after the image of Christ in his resurrection. So I dispute that.
Okay.
Position. Was there another part of the question? Oh, the anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
So anti-Semitism, a little bit trickier there. There's no doubt that early Christianity was born within Jewish culture and elicited an immediate reaction from Jewish authorities of the day who rejected Christ as the Messiah. And there was animus between early Christianity and Judaism. And that animus is reflected not only in the New Testament, but also in rabbinical writings, like in the Talmud. All right, so the Talmudic tradition has some nasty things to say about Christians and early Christianity and the person of Jesus. So it kind of ran both ways. And there was confusion within the 1st and 2nd century church about the degree of coherence that could exist between Christian faith and the Judaism out of which it was born. And church fathers were keen on drawing those lines of differentiation. And you mentioned Gnosticism. Sometimes some of the early heresies partook not only of Gnostic but also of Judaistic tendencies, and those things got confused. And so in polemics against Gnosticism sometimes took on an anti-Semitic character. And then that continued in the writings of the 4th century fathers like St. John Chrysostom, for instance. Clearly, identifying Judaism as a religious system and finding differences between the rabbis and Christian theology is one thing. Allowing those differences to spill over into cultural prejudice against Jews as a people, that's a totally different animal. All right, that's a different thing. Something that the church, with the benefit of hindsight, recognizes as deeply wrong and has condemned, especially since the Second Vatican Council, consistently. But could we have done better in that department, especially in the Middle Ages? No doubt. No doubt about it.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your question there, Justin. Speaking of Hellenistic influence, we actually have a text from Helen. So she is always Hellenistic, right?
Oh, yeah.
I just couldn't resist that. We're going to answer her question on the other side, so you can be thinking about that during the break. She wants to know what are the differences between a church, a cathedral, a co-cathedral, and a basilica. So you can chew on that a little bit during the break here. We'll also be taking a question from Nicole in Chino Hills, California. We've got some emails, some text to tackle, and we've got an open phone line for you right now. Look at that. And the number is 833-288-EWTN, 833-288-3986 if you have a question for Dr. David Anders. This is Called to Communion on this Wednesday afternoon. Glad you could join us here on EWTN. Do stay with us.
Krista.
If you talk to professional philosophers, they are not relativists. Philosophically, relativism can't be justified. People sacrifice objective truth, objective morality on the altar of personal liberty. In other words, in pursuit of what I want to do, I will say, well, that is not binding on me. That's just your opinion.
Krista in the afternoons, weekdays at 4 p.m. Eastern on EWTN Radio.
Christ is the answer, with Father John Riccardo.
John, chapter 8, verse 51. Jesus is in a discussion with some of the leaders of the Jews. They're talking about Abraham. Abraham lived 1,500 years before the time of Jesus. So in the course of the discussion, Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, if anyone keeps my word, he will never see death." He says that often in the Gospels. "He who keeps my word or believes in me will never die." To which the Jews say, "Now we know you have a demon." And they say, "Abraham died, as did the prophets. All the patriarchs, the great men and women of the history of Israel. All these people died, and you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death? Are you greater than our father Abraham, who died? And the prophets who died?" And Jesus says, "Your father Abraham rejoiced that he was to see my day. He saw it and was glad." To which the Jews say, "You are not yet 50 years old, and you've seen Abraham?" And Jesus answers, "Truly, truly, I say to you, before Abraham was, I am."
The wisdom of Mother Angelica.
And we need to pray for all our world leaders and all those who are in such danger. See, in a day and age where people are getting further away from God, you get further away from goodness. Only God is good. Do you remember what our Lord said one day? "Why do you call me good?" he said. "Only God is good. Only God."
EWTN. Live truth. Live Catholic.
Hi, this is Cy Kellett. Later today on Catholic Answers Live, Carlo Broussard is in to discuss nature's blueprint for sexuality, and then Joe Sikora will be here to explain how you can choose joy. Catholic Answers Live, 6 p.m. Eastern here on EWTN Radio. Now, back to Call to Communion with Dr. David Anders.
What's stopping you from becoming a Catholic? You are called to communion with Dr. David Anders. 1-833-288-EWTN. 1-833-288-3986.
Welcome back. We have one line available right now at 833-288-EWTN. We'll try to get to as many calls as we can in the next half hour or so. So here's that question, and I did apologize to David for that stupid joke that I made about Helen, our texter, being Hellenistic.
No, I got a kick out of it, but actually somebody in the kitchen outside the studio had set a pizza on fire, and I was afraid that something in the studio was burning. I was looking around while you were talking, like was one of the computers on fire or something? And so I was a little bit distracted. Otherwise, I would have hee-hawed at the Helen joke.
That smell that you smelled, that was actually me thinking.
Okay.
I try not to do it very much.
Yeah,
anyway,
right.
The question that Helen had, what are the differences between a church, a cathedral, a co-cathedral, and a basilica? Can you break that down for us?
Yeah, sure. So a basilica initially is an architectural form within Roman architecture that was adopted as a style for Christian churches in ancient Christianity and came to be associated with churches of some prominence and importance. And there are various rankings of basilica in Catholic tradition, like a major and papal basilica is the highest, and I think that like only the Pope has the right to celebrate Mass on that altar or to designate that right. You have to get his permission. And there are a number of those papal basilicas in the Diocese of Rome, for instance. There's also a minor basilica, which is a kind of a dignity that can be ascribed to a particular church for some reason. We actually have a basilica not far from here. Are you aware that there's a basilica in the Diocese of Atlanta?
I did not know that.
Yeah, there's I think it's the Basilica of the Sacred Heart in Atlanta. I've been to Mass there one time.
Really?
Yeah, delightful little church. And then sometimes, pilgrimage sites will be designated basilicas. So, for instance, a number of years ago, I had the privilege of going to Lisieux in France and to the shrine of St. Therese of Lisieux. And they have a basilica dedicated, as a pilgrimage site there with her relics and so forth. A co-cathedral would be when you have a diocese where there's a cathedral. Now, the cathedral is where the bishop has his seat. Right? Cathedra means seat, okay? Bishop's seat. A co-cathedral would be a church in a diocese that shares the privilege of being the seat of the bishop with the major cathedral, with the main cathedral.
Yeah, when I lived in Missouri, the lower half of Missouri, the diocese is Springfield, Cape Girardeau. And Springfield is on one side of the state, Cape Girardeau is on the other side of the state.
Do they have a co-cathedral there?
Sure do. I've been to that co-cathedral in Cape Girardeau.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
And then a church, is a building designated and consecrated for the celebration of the sacraments, Holy Mass, and so forth, and usually administered by a priest who's named pastor of that parish church.
Okay, very good. Hope that's helpful for you. Thank you so much for your email, or your text, actually, Helen. Thank you so much. Back to the phones right now at 833-288-EWTN. We'll continue here with Nicole in Chino Hills, California, listening to us via Sirius XM 130. Hey there, Nicole. What's your question today?
My question is very specific to Judges 19. I think it's Judges 19, the concubine that was cut up into 12 pieces and her body was dispersed among the tribes. I want to know how you would handle that if somebody says to you, well, that is evidence that the Old Testament suppresses and oppresses women, and they cite that passage specifically. How would you handle that objection?
Yeah, thanks. I understand the question. I appreciate it. So first of all, as a Catholic aspiring theologian, I am under no obligation to defend or advocate for every cultural practice in ancient Israel. Far from it. All right, I don't regard individual anecdotes from the Old Testament as in any way moral exemplars to be imitated by Christians. I mean, there are instances of moral heroism in the Old Testament, but many things that are recounted that fall far short of the moral standards articulated by Jesus. And Christ himself acknowledged this principle in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 19, when he was asked about divorce. And he said, you can't divorce your wife for any reason. And the Pharisees said, well, then why does Moses permit you to write your wife a certificate of divorce? And Jesus said, because of your hardness of heart. But then he calls us to a higher standard, okay? So there was, even within the Mosaic law, there was a kind of built-in concession to human weakness and a kind of condescension to the cultural norms at the time, which we're told it specifically was suboptimal, all right, and is transcended by the gospel, defined by the law of love of God above all things, and neighbor as oneself. So I think that discussion is rather repulsive, and I certainly I'm not in favor of cutting up concubines. Now, let me fast forward a little bit to the first centuries of the Christian church and talk about the status of women in the Catholic Church and how that stacks up against other cultures. So if you know anything about ancient Roman history, you know that women were property of their husbands, and the pater familias, the father of the family, had the power of life and death over his wife and his children, and that strict continence and chastity was imposed on women, but not on men, who were free to take concubines and prostitutes and so on and so forth as their fancies and proclivities would allow. One of the things that the Catholic Church did at a very early age was make this radical claim that women could not be compelled to marry against their will. And some of the earliest martyrs in the Christian tradition are, in fact, virgin martyrs, Christian women who refused to marry against their will and preferred to consecrate their virginity to God and suffered death as a result at the hands of Roman persecutors and are venerated as martyred saints by the Catholic Church. And to this day, in Catholic tradition, forced marriages are invalid and are not recognized as valid. That was a radical shift in the dignity of women and their inherent freedom and humanity brought about by the Catholic faith, not present in other parts of the world. I think, one of the most, as the Catholic Church moved into the Saxon, Frankish, and Celtic world of Western Europe. There was also a tradition of forcing women to marry against their will, and the Catholic Church nullified that. Okay, in fact, the Catholic Church allowed for secret marriages contracted between the parties and the witness of a priest, right? And that's not the typical practice today, of course, in the Catholic Church, but it allowed it in principle they could happen, even apart from the permission of the families, which was kind of a radical idea. It's not the way Saxon, Celtic, pagan culture operated, and it was destabilizing. It seemed as kind of a radical concession to women. All right, and there are other ways in which the Catholic Church was liberating to women, not only in granting them the dignity of their own self-determination with respect to marriage, but also the Church's teaching on sexual morality was tremendously liberating to women, because in a culture where men owned women as property and could cavort with concubines and prostitutes at will, obviously unwanted pregnancies would sometimes happen. And to either prevent that or resolve that difficulty, men would resort to extraordinarily harmful contraceptives. You think contraceptives are an invention of the modern era. That's not true. They had them in the ancient world, too. They had even spermicides and the like that functioned in disgustingly unhygienic ways that were very, very difficult for a woman's body. And abortions, of course, you didn't have to consult the woman's permission about that. If you were the father of the child and you didn't want it, you could attempt to induce abortion, and that happened often by beating, often by jumping up and down on women's stomachs and horrible abuse like that. Needless to say, when the Church came along in the 2nd, 3rd century, 4th century, and said, number one, men are required to be continent and chaste, just like women. 2, women have the right over their own bodies and cannot be forced to marry against their will. 3, abortion is always wrong. 4, contraception is always wrong. Oh, and let's not forget child abandonment and exposure, which was disproportionately practiced on females. Okay, it's no wonder that the Catholic Church was seen as a tremendous, tremendous liberation for women in that community, which explains why women were more likely than men to join the Catholic Church in the 2nd century and 3rd century and 4th century and so forth, all right, and remain among the great martyrs and the saints and the heroes of Catholic tradition, Catholic culture. So not only in the respect of women, but the subjugated and the oppressed and the downtrodden across cultures, the Catholic Church elevated them and changed the entire conception of art, of beauty, and of civil law from something that was pagan to something that recognized the dignity of the human person. Now, in the modern era, I would say in the post-feminist era, the Catholic Church continues to stand for the dignity of women in a way that the secular world denies. So one of the things that I find interesting about modern, especially second-wave feminism, illustrated by somebody like Simone de Beauvoir, is to suggest that a woman's dignity or her freedom must somehow be detached from her gender identity as a woman. Simone de Beauvoir was famous for saying, one is not born, one becomes a woman, all right? And hence gives birth to this whole idea that gender expression and gender identity are something freely chosen rather than something intrinsic to one's biology. And that in order to achieve dignity or freedom, that women have to compete with men, say in the workplace or in government, and in ways that are familiarly masculine, and that often require them to renounce their biologically feminine identity, in particular their ability to bear children. And so, a secular writer like Danielle Crittenden, in her book, What Our Mothers Never Told Us, complains about the fruit of modern feminism in her life and the lives of her contemporaries, where they bought the lie, right, that to be a liberated woman, they had to compete with men in the workplace or in government or in academe and deny their biological femininity and their desire for children so they could climb the corporate ladder. And then having done that, at the age of 45 or 50 or whatever, looking back on their lives and realizing that the accomplishment seems rather hollow in comparison to the sacrifice of giving up children, all right? Whereas the Catholic faith says, yes, if you want to climb the corporate ladder, great, go ahead, climb the corporate ladder. We're all about women in positions of power and influence. This own network, EWTN, was founded by a very powerful woman.
That's right.
who was not quick to let men boss her around, I'll tell you that, and did tremendous good for the church. I work in Catholic diocesan administration, and I'll tell you that I went to work this morning and I looked around and I was like, where are all the men? All right, I was the only guy on the floor today. Everybody else was a woman, all right, and they're running the show, right? And I'm asking their counsel and advice all day long, and sometimes they give me what for, and deservedly so. And I appreciate that their leadership and their authority and their wisdom and insight. Catholic Church has always had a role like that for women in administration, teaching, and so forth. But if you want to be a mother, if you want to be a wife, if you want to raise a family, that's also a tremendous dignity that the church does not deny you, all right? Recognizing this is something uniquely feminine that only a woman can do, all right? And it's a tremendous gift to the church and to the world and to society. So you want to go the route of climbing the corporate ladder? Have at it. You want to have a family? Have at it. Let's alter society not to make women into men, but to make men and women equal in dignity, acknowledging that they're not the same, and each one can pursue the path of their vocation in the way that's best for them.
Nicole, thank you so much for your call. We do appreciate it. It's Call to Communion here on EWTN. We're going to go now to Stephanie in Burlington, Ontario. Hey there, Stephanie. What's on your mind today?
Hi, Dr. David Enders. Thank you for taking my call. I'm just calling because I have somebody who's seems really interested in anytime I bring up conversation about the faith, and but their perspective about a devout prayer practice, like if they look at people who are diligently praying, they just see this as strict. And so usually I just say, well, the devotion of a person comes from it's coming from love. So you're not going to just pick up a strict prayer practice unless you are drawn to that. And I was just wondering if you had any other additional advice, or if you could help me expand on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I really appreciate it. So I certainly hope it's strict. I really do. And when I look at any other realm of human endeavor, in which I could flourish or be successful or grow or excel, the old adage from the weightlifting campaign, no pain, no gain, holds true, So when I was going through school, I wanted to make straight A's and be the best student that I could be. And you know what I did? I followed a very strict regimen. I studied very hard. I was diligent in my work. If I want to advance in my career, I had better do the same thing. If you want to lose weight, you have to follow a pretty strict regimen. I mean, I've got a calorie counter on my cell phone and, kind of track, I'm 100 calories over the limit. I better go to the gym and knock off an extra 100 more. I'm strict in following that. Outside the Catholic tradition, when you look at other spiritual traditions, whether you look at Judaism or Islam or Buddhism or Hinduism or Confucianism or whatever, many traditions prescribe spiritual disciplines that could be perceived as quite strict, sometimes much more demanding than spiritual practice within the Catholic tradition. Why? Because they attempt, at least, to aim at a transcendent good. And there's a recognition universally, I think, in human cultures that the horizon of human destiny reaches beyond the mere temporal to the eternal, and that this transcends our natural human capacity, and that hopefully through grace, all right, many people seek to accomplish this by human effort, but with the cooperation of grace, that some sort of strict regimen is necessary oftentimes to overcome our attachment to the flesh, to our concupiscence, our pride, to those things that would draw us down into earthly life. So I certainly hope that my prayer life is strict. I think sometimes I go to confession and I confess that my prayer life is not strict enough. All right. So if someone wants to suggest that the discipline of prayer is strict, to me that's a compliment, right? That's not in any way an insult. But I also think the answer you give is perfectly pertinent, absolutely germane. That the motivation for prayer is not some sort of transaction with God where I barter with Him or earn my salvation or something like that. The motivation is to develop a relationship in love. Now, the paradigm for loving relationship is the relationship of a husband to a wife or a wife to a husband. And while there's tremendous freedom in a marital relationship, hopefully there's a lot of strictness too. My marriage is constrained by some pretty strict rules. One man, one woman, and that's all she wrote. No going anywhere else. I'm strictly constrained in my love relationship to point my affections to my wife alone, and she likewise. And I have certain duties towards her. I mean, I have to, this afternoon we were sort of bartering back and forth about who's going to pick up the kids and who's going to drop off the kids, and we're trying to coordinate our life. That requires sacrifice on both our parts, right, to meet all those arduous demands. Is that strict? You bet. What motivates that strictness? We love each other. We want to be each one another's service.
Stephanie, thank you so much for your call. We do appreciate it. This is Call to Communion here on EWTN. I want to bring something to your attention you may not be aware of, and that is a very cool division of EWTN called Church Pop. Have you ever heard of it? It is neat. It features new online Christian content that is fun, informative, and inspirational. I just went to Church Pop just to check it out right now. Here's an example. 20 of the strangest things in Catholic culture, according to a former Protestant. That would be a very cool list to look at. How about this one? Mark Wahlberg and his wife celebrate their daughter's first communion on Instagram. That you may want to check out on Church Pop. And here's one. A priest reveals at the Rome Conference Muslims in the Arab world call on Catholic priests for exorcisms. I want to read that. Boy, you talk about clickbait. That is good stuff. So do check it out. Church Pop, now available on Snapchat, on Instagram, and right here on the web at churchpop.com. Churchpop.com. It is very cool. Let's go now to Elizabeth in Kansas City, listening on KEXS. Hey there, Elizabeth. What's your question today?
Hi, Dr. Anders. I have a neighbor who's a Freemason, and he laughs at me when I talk about how I believe Freemasonry is from hell and how the higher degrees of Freemasons actually make oaths to Satan. And he thought that was just all pretty funny and just kind of wrote me off. But my question to you is, and we were talking about this, once someone gets up to like a high degree of Freemasonry and has already made those oaths to Satan, is there something that they do have experience that they would have to do to disassociate, like a formal right to disassociate themselves from Freemasonry after
thanks.
they made an oath like that?
I appreciate the question, Elizabeth. Thank you very much. So Freemasonry is contrary to the teaching and practice and law of the Catholic Church, and Catholics are not permitted to be Freemasons. And there are a number of reasons for that. I mean, at the heart of Freemasonry is a commitment to the doctrine of indifferentism, the idea that it doesn't matter what religious tradition one adheres to. And it does matter. It matters that one adhere to the church founded by Christ. Okay, and so that's contrary to the teaching of Catholicism. Also, historically, Freemasons have worked to subvert Catholic influence in the public sphere, right? And the Catholic Church has every right to be operating in the public sphere, to seek to be salt and light, and to bring the principles of human dignity and love and respect and the grace of the sacraments to as many people as possible. And so, again, it stands to reason that the Church would not allow people to join an organization that historically has existed, at least in part, to thwart the public ministry of the Catholic Church. Now, there are obviously many people involved in Freemasonry who are not motivated by, nor particularly knowledgeable about, these aspects of Freemasonry and its identity. All right. Nevertheless, they are kind of woven into the fabric of the tradition, that is to say, the Freemasonry tradition, and therefore membership in the Freemason organization and Catholic Church is incompatible. Now, with respect to the specific questions you raised about the various ranks and hierarchies within Freemasonry and oaths that people have to take, I confess that I am not an expert on the various levels of Freemasonry and precisely what oaths you're speaking of, and how those oaths are to be interpreted, okay? And so I don't want to speak to that question specifically. I will say, let's speak in general terms about if someone were to take an oath that directly obligated them somehow to the devil or to the demons and so forth, or opened them up to malevolent spiritual influence in that way, then I say that it would be very advisable for them to renounce that in the context of the confessional, in the presence of a priest, and perhaps even to seek spiritual liberation if that were judged necessary. If not, probably not in a major exorcism, unless there was evidence of overt demonic activity, but perhaps in a minor exorcism or a prayer of liberation that requires the competence of a priest to perform. But these would be judgment calls for the individual pastor dealing with an individual soul. As far as there being any canonical requirement, anybody who converts to the Catholic Church and submits to baptism actually does go through an exorcism. Part of the baptism ritual is, in fact, an exorcism for precisely this kind of reason. Many people in antiquity that joined the Catholic Church came out of occultic practices, and they were required to renounce Satan as they entered into the Catholic Church. If you've ever attended the Easter Vigil liturgy, even practicing Catholics renew their baptismal vows and their renunciation of Satan as part of the public liturgy of the Church. But the questions you raise would be best dealt with in the internal forum in the context of one's confessor.
Very good article on Catholic.com. Our friends at Catholic Answers Live posted a great article called "What Does the Church Say About Freemasonry?" So you can probably get a little more in-depth information right there. Thank you so much for your call, Elizabeth. Let's go now to Karen in northwestern Kansas, listening on Sirius XM 130. Karen, what's on your mind today?
Okay, I was asked this question and I couldn't answer it. We have priests, we have monsignors, we have bishops, we have archbishops, we have cardinals. How does a priest become monsignor or a bishop or an archbishop? I don't know.
Okay, thanks. I can take a stab at that. So, the title Monsignor is an honorific that's awarded by the Pope, generally at the request of a bishop, for some priest who has had an honorable career and the bishop wishes to honor him. Now, as I understand it, I believe that Pope Francis has eliminated the practice of naming priests Monsignor. Those that have the title are permitted to continue to carry it, but there are no new Monsignors being named in Catholic dioceses. At least that's my understanding, unless things have changed. To become a bishop, the typical procedure is that when there's an episcopal see, that is to say, a bishopric, like I live in the Diocese of Birmingham, when there's a diocese that is vacated, a bishop dies or retires or whatever, and there's a need for a new bishop, the Conference of Catholic Bishops in that region, in our country it would be the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, will recommend a candidate to the Holy See, to the Pope. Sometimes that would mean moving an existing bishop from one diocese to another, but it might mean the ordination of a new bishop. Generally the character and experience and education and spirituality of a candidate will be considered. All right, you would hope so. And Sacred Scripture gives rules actually concerning who would make a good bishop and who wouldn't. But in terms of to actually effect the ordination of a bishop, it's the highest grade of ecclesiastical orders, and you receive episcopal consecration from other ordained bishops so that you have valid apostolic succession with the approval of the Pope, of course. The cardinalate is a special job that the Pope delegates to those that he desires as advisors, and also that have the job of electing the new Pope in the case that the current Pope dies or resigns his pontificate. Generally speaking, cardinals are bishops. Pope has made priests as cardinals in history past. Cardinal Avery Dulles, an American theologian, was named a cardinal. He was not a bishop. John Henry Newman, a famous Catholic theologian from the 19th century, was ordained a priest but not a bishop. He was also named a cardinal by Pope Leo XIII.
Karen, thank you so much for your call. Dr. David Anders, thank you, my friend.
Thanks, Tom.
See you tomorrow right here on another edition of Call to Communion. I'm Tom Price. Have a great day. God bless.